A hospital in the UK is reportedly asking biological men if they might be pregnant, and the reason is as weird as you would think. Also, President Biden released his proposed budget to Congress this week, and as expected, it's a pile of hot garbage. Speaking of garbage, from artist lofts to football fields to a Gandhi museum in Houston, here's how Congress just spent billions of dollars of your cash. Welcome to the Brittany Hughes Show. Hey guys, welcome back to the Brittany Hughes Show. So this week in stupid news. I know. What a way to start the show, because there is so much to choose from. It's mind-boggling. Real quick interruption, and then I promise we'll get back to the show. For those of you who are watching this podcast on MRCTV.org, make sure that you hop over to iTunes, Odyssey, iHeartRadio, wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the show. That way, you're guaranteed not to miss an episode. Now back to the good stuff. So President Biden's budget, again, it's not funny. It's not funny until you kind of look at what's in this nonsense. So President Biden released his budget, proposed budget for 2023 to Congress this week. It's so bad. Oh my gosh, it's so bad. First of all, the amount of money that he's asking for is absolutely staggering. Wait until I tell you what's actually in it. Okay, so this came from the White House statement that accompanied the budget. And I'm going to quote from the very first line of this statement. Biden says, quote, "Budgets are statements of values. And the budget I'm releasing today sends a clear message that we value fiscal responsibility, safety and security at home and around the world." Fiscal responsibility. Okay, so let's talk about that for a second. First of all, this budget proposes $5.8 trillion in spending. Okay, that's a 32% increase over federal spending just 4 years ago, $5.8 trillion. Now, let's talk about that for just a second, because I think what happens is when we talk about federal spending, the numbers are so mind-blowing. We've kind of been desensitized to what they actually mean. We hear words like millions or billions or even trillions, and that kind of bounces off at us. If we were talking about our household budget, that would be staggering. But when we're talking about federal spending, that's kind of like, okay, well, that's what the government spends. That's been what it's been spending for years now. And so we kind of don't really think about it in realistic terms. Let's talk about $5.8 trillion, though, and bring that kind of into perspective. So $1 million. Most of us would consider $1 million to be a lot of money. Kind of the idea that, well, what would you wish for if you had one wish? Oh, I wish I had $1 million. $1 million for the average American who makes about $50,000 to $60,000 a year. $1 million is an enormous sum of money that most of us will never see in our life. Most of us will never have $1 million sitting in a bank. Think about this. $1 million 1 million times over, that's $1 trillion. $1 million times 1 million is 1 trillion. This is that times about 6. I mean, when you think about it in those terms, it is a mind-blowing amount of cash, and it's your cash and it's my cash. This is money that's being forcibly taken from us by the government. Almost $6 trillion. So the Heritage Foundation estimates that this budget and the plans in this budget would equate to $72.7 trillion in spending over the next decade, averaging more than $1.4 trillion in higher annual spending than we're spending right now. Again, mind-blowing amounts of money. Debt would skyrocket from $30.2 trillion today to more than $44.8 trillion over the next decade. Annual budget deficits would start at $1.2 trillion in fiscal year 2023 and rise to $1.8 trillion by 2032. So again, just to differentiate, that's what we owe. The deficit is the difference between what the government is spending and what it's taking in every year, right? Both of those would absolutely balloon under this plan. So how's he going to pay for it? Well, theoretically, part of this budget includes $2.5 trillion in tax increases. Democrats' favorite thing, right? It raises corporate rates from 21 to 28%. Now, corporate rates, experts have estimated that about 75 to 100% of corporate tax hikes are actually borne by the employees. That's you, not the CEOs that run the company. So corporate tax hikes just get passed along to the average everyday American worker, right? This budget still anticipates, even with all of that, even with the tax hikes, even with more revenue being brought in than ever before, still anticipates $4.64 trillion in revenue, and therefore a deficit of $1.1 trillion. So again, imagine as a household, if you bring in, let's just keep the math kind of easy because I don't really math all that well. Let's say that you bring in $100,000 a year. But your budget going into the year, knowing that you're only going to take in $100,000 a year, your budget has you spending $115,000 a year. You're going into it understanding that you don't have the money, and that's exactly what Biden is doing. So you would think that if you're only going to take in $4.64 trillion, again, only as if that's a small amount of money, ridiculous. But if you're only going to take in that much, you would start to look pretty heavily at what you're going to spend that money on and make sure that you are spending wisely based on what you actually have. Of course, that's not at all what Biden's doing, and that's not what he's going to plan on doing. Here are some of the things, just some, by the way. This is by no means an exhaustive list whatsoever. Here are some of the things that are actually in Biden's budget. I'm going to read off a list here. $65 billion for the Department of Energy to upgrade infrastructure, including purchasing thousands of electric school buses. It includes $45 billion in total climate change spending. That includes $1.4 billion to deploy a nationwide publicly accessible network of electric vehicle chargers and other alternative fueling infrastructure. So we're going to have electric car chargers everywhere. And we're supposed to bend over backwards and thank him for this as if we're not the ones paying for it, even if we don't actually own an electric car because we can't afford one, in part because most of our money is being taken by the government. So it also includes another $1.4 million to launch an Office for Environmental Justice. Yay. Whatever that means, which I'm sure at $1.4 million is a total steal, and it's not going to take more on top of that every single year to keep that bloated nonsense from running. $1.4 million for that. You're going to love this one if you travel a whole lot. Another $1.6 billion for the TSA so that you can continue to get strip searched at the airport. Another $1.6 billion for immigration judges to address the illegal alien crisis. That's $621 million more than in 2021. So almost just shy of doubling the budget for immigration judges. Again, that's not to address the illegal alien crisis. That's not to deter people from coming here. That's not to do anything other than process them, many of whom will then be let into the country. So we're going to be coughing up almost $2 billion for immigration judges if this budget were to get passed. Another $1 billion to support Violence Against Women Act of 1994. Sounds great, right? Yeah, no. So that's nearly twice as much as was spent in 2021 on these programs. Biden's plan will include more support for transgender survivors, building community-based organizational capacity to combat online harassment and abuse, and to address emerging issues in gender-based violence. If those aren't a whole lot of words to say absolutely nothing. That's another thing. If you ever look at these budgets, the gobbledygook language that's included in these that don't actually tell you what the program is, what the initiative is going to do, it kind of just uses generic language that doesn't really mean anything to build community-based organizational capacity. I'm sorry. But at $1 billion of American taxpayer money, shouldn't you be able to tell me exactly what you're going to do with it? But they don't do that. They wrap it all up in this flowery, nonsensical language that doesn't actually have any meaning, because you would be an idiot if you don't support taking precautions or combating violence against women, right? It also includes another $10 billion to assist with refugee resettlement programs around the world, as well as $2.6 billion to advance gender equity and equality around the world. Again, yay. $2.6 billion to advance gender equity and equality around the world. Now, how are we going to pay for all of this? By the way, like I said, that's not even close to an exhaustive list of the nonsense. I actually went through most of the budget. It's forever long. And none of that includes the billions upon billions upon billions of dollars that we would spend on defense, that we would spend on the Department of the Interior, that we would spend on any other slew of the nonsensical agencies. And how are we going to pay for all of this? Well, we are going to tax the billionaires. That's going to solve all of our problems, because as Democrats continue to spend and spend and spend and spend, there is one boogeyman that they continue to blame. That's the billionaires. If we would just tax all the dadgum billionaires, it would solve every single problem in the universe. Here's Biden saying that if billionaires would only pay their fair share, all of our problems would be solved. Here you go.
Not going to pay a single penny in additional federal taxes. And the wealthy and corporations will finally begin to pay their fair share. For most Americans, the last few years were very hard, stretching them to the breaking point. But billionaires and large corporations got richer than ever. Right now, billionaires pay an average rate of 8% on their total income. 8%, that's the average they pay. Now, I'm a capitalist, but if you can make $1 billion, great. Just pay your fair share. Pay a little bit. A firefighter and a teacher pay more than double the tax rate that a billionaire pays. That's not right.
Okay, so taxing billionaires. You notice, by the way, that whenever the left talks about taxing billionaires or taxing the rich or taxing the 1% or whatever, you notice how they always use the words fair share, but they can never actually define what a fair share is. What is a fair share of cash that you earned that someone else didn't? What is a fair share for somebody that makes $200,000 versus somebody that makes $25,000? What is that fair share? And they can never actually put a number with it, because that number keeps going up and up and up. It will never actually reach a fair share where they cap it and they say, okay, we're good. We've got all we need out of you guys. It's not your responsibility anymore. 110%. That would probably be what a Democrat would say is truly their idea of a fair share. So once you get past all of the weird whispering and why does he keep whispering?
That's not right.
That I don't understand. No amount of intense whispering makes any of this nonsense true. So let's go through, first of all, the idea that the average teacher and firefighter in America pays twice the tax rate of a billionaire. Let's deal with the tax rate itself. So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the average high school teacher in America made just shy of $63,000 a year in 2020. Now, that's actually a little bit higher by about $10,000 than the average American worker's salary, which is about $52,000 a year. I know a lot of teachers make less than that, but that was the average. So a salaried firefighter made about $54,000 a year in 2017. Obviously, you're going to adjust up a little bit for inflation, assuming that your wages actually went up, which many of them haven't. So that's according to Forbes. This puts both teachers and firefighters in the 12% bracket for federal income tax, assuming that they're single. Now, obviously, you pay more than that depending on what state you live in, but federal income tax, you're sitting at 12% if you are either a high school teacher or just a teacher in general, or a salaried firefighter. A teacher married to a firefighter making a combined salary of about $117,000 a year and filing jointly would pay 24%, so still 12% apiece. Billionaires, on the other hand, and I'm not one, I assume you're not either. Billionaires, if you happen to be one, congrats to you. Leave your name in the comments. I'd like to know who you are. They have to cough up about 37% of their annual income to the federal government. Now, this is part of what Democrats are hoping to do over the next year, is to actually raise that to closer to 40% and then slap a massive capital gains tax on top of that. That is going to be how they plan to tax billionaires and get them to pay their quote unquote fair share. So even if you assume that Biden meant to say taxes rather than tax rate, even if you ignore the gaffe, because clearly 37% is way more than 12%. If you're a billionaire, your tax rate is infinitely higher than the average teacher. Even if you assume that he meant to say taxes, though, instead of tax rate, it's still proven that the top 1% of all U.S. earners, so that would be, according to the IRS, those making $540,000 above, pay about 40% of all federal taxes collected in a year. The top 1%, making about $500,000 and more, pay about 40% of all federal income taxes. Yahoo News reported that in 2018, the top 1% paid about $615 billion in federal income taxes, which accounted for about 40% of all federal income taxes paid. The bottom 50% of workers, by the way, paid about 3%. So again, that leads to the question, what is fair share? If you take the fact that the top 1% is paying 40% of all of the federal income taxes that are collected in any given year, and you have to think that that's even more than that if you add in, state taxes in some of these places like New York and California that have astronomically high state income taxes. Which, by the way, great argument for the flat tax for those of you saying that there are tax loopholes that get rich people out of having to pay all of their taxes. Fantastic argument for a flat tax where everybody simply pays taxes in accordance with what they make. That, if you're really talking about a fair share, would be more fair. But right now, there already seems to be a massive disparity between what people pay when they have a lot and what they pay when they have far, far less. I'm going to read from PolitiFact here, just in case the fact checkers have decided to come after this, because this is something that, again, the left likes to dispute, but by splitting hairs. So I'm going to read straight from PolitiFact here, which rated this mostly true, by the way. With its 2021 list of world billionaires, Forbes estimated that there were 724 U.S. billionaires as of March 5th, the most in any one nation, worth a total of $4.4 trillion. So the Institute for Policy Studies actually took that a next step, estimated that as of October 15th, there were 745 U.S. billionaires, together worth slightly more than $5 trillion. That's a 70% collective increase in fortune since the start of the COVID-19 outbreak. The fiscal 2022 budget lists $7.5 trillion in outlays for the fiscal year of 2021. The government spends $7 trillion in a year, or about $19 billion per day. All of that said, that all means that even if you taxed billionaires $5 trillion, their collective $5 trillion in wealth, and you taxed it 100%, that would pay for about 263 days of federal government spending. That's about 9 months. So clearly the idea of taxing billionaires, this idea that we're just going to continually take more and more from those who make the most, and that's going to somehow fix all of this, that the reason that we're struggling to pay our bills, and the reason that our deficit continues, and the reason that our debt continues to go up, and the reason that we can't pay for all of these programs, and that we can't give the average American what they need, is because the billionaires are greedy and hoarding all of their cash, is nonsensical when you look at how far that money would actually go if Democrats were to take every single penny of it. And here's why. There is absolutely no way that you can ever, ever tax your way out of the spending problem that the federal government has. You can take every dime that every single person earns. I don't care if your budget is set at 1 trillion or 10 trillion or 100 trillion. The federal government is going to come up with a way to spend every single penny and tell you that it needs more and that it doesn't have enough. Let me give you some examples, by the way. If you didn't notice, about 3 weeks ago, Congress passed the omnibus spending bill to the tune of $1.5 trillion. So remember, again, that $1 million a million times over is $1 trillion. This is that plus another 50%. Okay, so $1.5 trillion in an omnibus spending bill that was over 2,700 pages long. Most lawmakers aren't going to read that, much less the average American. And again, we become so desensitized to these numbers. We become so desensitized to these massive spending bills, we barely even notice when they happen. And we definitely don't know what's in them because nobody's going to go through all of that except for weirdos like me. The legislation included more than 4,000 earmarks, spanning 367 pages and totaling at least $10 billion in your tax dollars. This is what they're spending it on, okay? $995,000 for grid resilience and equity in the energy transition research at the University of Massachusetts, allegedly to fix perceived racist inequality in the state's energy system. That was Senator Warren, by the way, in case you couldn't figure that out. Grid resilience and equity in the energy transition. $750,000 to turn the Hockessin Colored School number 107, that was the school that was very heavily focused on in Brown versus Board of Education, into a center for diversity, inclusion, and social equity. $750,000. $496,000 for YMCA pool improvements to create health equity. That was after Representative Jamal Bowman in New York argued that Black and Hispanic children do not have access to swimming resources. He did not actually clarify why the pools themselves needed upgrades to the tune of almost $500,000, but apparently Black and brown children don't know how to swim, and we need to dump $496,000 into the YMCA to fix it up. Another $500,000 earmarked for the Worcester State University for minority students to study climate change. $500,000. If you're into museums, there was a whole lot of pork in there for that. $3 million for the Gandhi Museum in Houston. That was courtesy of Democrat Representative Al Green of Texas. $2.5 million for additions to the Fairbanks Museum and Planetarium in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. That was courtesy of Congressman Peter Welch, also a Democrat. $3 million for the Palo Alto History Museum. That was thanks to Congresswoman Anna Eshoo of California, Democrat. $2.2 million to build a Bahamian Arts, History, and Cultural Center in Coconut Grove. That was courtesy of Democrat Florida Congresswoman Frederica Wilson. $500,000 for the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. It's a museum in Cincinnati dedicated to telling the stories of the Underground Railroad and the journey to freedom after the horrors of slavery. $500,000. $1.15 million for the National Center for Education and Conservation of Florida's Coral Reef. That was thanks to Florida GOP Congresswoman Maria Salazar. The bill gave $1 million to the Amelia Earhart Hanger Museum in Kansas, thanks to Senator Jerry Moran. $3 million for the Brooklyn Museum, $1.1 million for Sullivan County's Rail Trail, and $1.5 million for capital improvements at St. George's Theater. All of that courtesy of New York Senator Chuck Schumer. Another $1.6 million was allocated to build an amphitheater in Fremont, Ohio. That's thanks to Democrat Senator Sherrod Brown. If you're into the environment, plenty in here for that. $1.6 million for Roger Williams University for the development of equitable growth of shellfish aquaculture in Rhode Island. That's thanks to Senators Jack Reed and Sheldon Whitehouse. $321,000 to reinvigorate Chinook salmon. Everybody likes salmon. I got to say, though, I think my local grocery store sells it for about $9 a pound. I thought that was expensive. $321,000 to reinvigorate salmon. Also, salmon, $750,000 for salmon in the Cook Inlet. That was thanks to Congressman Todd Young of Alaska. $570,000 to remove derelict lobster pots in Connecticut. That's thanks to Senators Blumenthal and Murphy. $650,000 for feral swine management. $4.2 million for the sheep experiment station, thanks to Congressman Mike Simpson. Go online, by the way, look that thing up. That's wild. $6.5 million for the eradication of the pale cyst nematode. Apparently, that's a potato pest. And funding for the National Institutes of Food and Agriculture for potato and wheat research, because apparently, after generations and generations and hundreds of years of eating potatoes and wheat, we haven't figured those things out. We need another $6.5 million to get rid of the pests and millions more to study potatoes and wheat. $70 million in funding for sage grouse conservation. If you don't know what a sage grouse is, it's this little thing right here. $1 million to compensate ranchers for livestock killed by wolves. This is my favorite category, by the way. Came up with this one on my own. It's called recreation and random crap. You ready for this? This is really going to cream your corn if it's not already. So $800,000 of your money, $800,000 for artist lofts in Pomona, California. That's thanks to Congresswoman Norma Torres. $209,000 for a creative village affordable housing and studio complex for artists in Decatur, Georgia. That's thanks to Democrat Representative Hank Johnson, you know, the one who thought that Guam was going to tip over. Yeah, thank him for that. $500,000 for a ski jump in New Hampshire. That's thanks to Democratic Senator Gene Sheehan. $1 million to build a soccer field in Johnston, Rhode Island. $2 million for new fields in Anaheim, California. That's just a little bit of the $10 billion minimum in pork that was included in this thing. Soccer fields, museums, saving the salmon. And of course, that doesn't include the billions and billions on defense and all of these departments and agencies like, you know, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency or the National Endowment for the Arts or the National Science Foundation that hands out thousands upon thousands and thousands of dollars in grants every single year. That's a whole other show that I could do on the grants that those places hand out for the most ridiculous research and experiments you could possibly imagine. This doesn't even include all of that. And oh, by the way, another $14 billion in aid for Ukraine. So this is a conversation that I have with a lot of people. I fight this fight all the time, and it drives me absolutely nuts. There needs to be an understanding here that not everything that is good or even necessary is the responsibility of the federal government and the American taxpayer. I'm not saying for 1 second that salmon conservation is a bad thing, or that museums are a bad thing, or that soccer fields are a bad thing. A lot of these things aren't necessarily bad things. Some of them are absolutely ridiculous, don't get me wrong. I don't really care about artist lofts in Pomona, California. Not sure anybody else does other than the people of Pomona, California. And I'm not even sure that y'all do, frankly. So some of this is absolutely ridiculous stuff. But a lot of this stuff, I have no problem with a ski jump in New Hampshire. I love to ski. Suck at it, but that's fine. Skiing is fun. I don't care. That's fine. But not everything that is good or necessary needs to come from the federal government. The federal government, when you look at the constitutional role laid down in the founding documents by the founding fathers, the constitutional role of the federal government is meant to be extremely narrow and small. What localities and states do with the taxes that they take in, that's a completely different story, and we can argue over that all day long, but the federal government was never meant to get involved in all of this nonsense, in all of this stuff, where it's become so massive and so bloated, and the money that's going through it is so mind-boggling that there's no way to actually keep track at this point of whether this is being spent wisely, and they know that. So what happens is, in a $1.5 trillion spending bill, They figure $10 billion in pork really isn't all that much. So they fit in all of their little pet projects. And make no mistake, when it comes to all of this stuff, here's what your tax dollars are paying for. And I don't care if you're talking about Democrats, Republicans, or the few independents that are in there. Your tax dollars are going to pay for these guys to get reelected. That's what this money is for. All of these little pet projects that get fit in, $1 million for this, $400,000 for this, all this money that's coming from you that's being funneled through Congress to pay for soccer fields and museums and all of these little things that these lawmakers promise to their communities, it's so that they can turn around and then ask for campaign donations and votes so that they can stay in power. And the cycle goes around and around and around. This is $10 billion in campaign cash. This is $10 billion for these guys to be able to take back to their hometowns and say, look what I got for you from Congress. You're going to vote for me again, right? That's what this is. So when you talk about budgets, when you talk about taxing billionaires, when you talk about, well, somebody needs to be paying more because they're not paying their fair share, when you have a government that is spending not just out of control, but spending purposefully above what they bring in and is going to take every single dime that they have and more to make sure that they fit in all of these projects that help them in their next election cycle, there is no way that you can tax your way out of that system. There's no way that you can take in enough to feed that beast. It's just going to keep growing and keep growing and keep growing. So the $5.8 trillion budget proposal of today is the $7 billion budget proposal of tomorrow. And the 37 to 40% tax hike for billionaires is the 45% tax hike tomorrow. It's going to keep going and keep going and keep going because Congress and the federal government have a spending problem. And make no mistake, it is not just Democrats who do it. Republicans vote for these bills time and time and time again. Republicans pass these bills when Republican presidents are in office. A lot of the projects that I just listed off for you were proposed by Republicans. So that's not necessarily a partisan thing. That's a federal government thing. And that's why it was so necessary before this became the Leviathan that it has, to make sure that government was scaled back to exactly what it needed to be. And of course, that ship has sailed to this point where we don't even recognize $1 trillion for what it truly, truly is. And what it's going to mean for our future and the future of our children and our grandchildren that are going to end up on the ship when it finally tips over. So if that's depressing to you, I guess you can just go out and buy yourself something pretty to make yourself feel better because if you can't afford it, tell the bank you're running a deficit that year and somebody else will pay for it. I mean, after all, if it's good enough for the federal government, right? So with that, thank you so much for joining me this week on The Brittany Hughes Show. Again, we are now on iTunes, so make sure you not only go and listen to old episodes, but subscribe to the podcast so that you don't miss an episode, and it'll give you a notification whenever there's a new one up. You can also check us out on Odyssey, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, anywhere you get your podcasts. And make sure you watch full episodes of the show on YouTube, Rumble, Instagram, and Facebook. We'll see you back here next week.